right, welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Making Monsters. We are finishing up our draft series. I've done, I think, 12, 13 episodes on different schools, different players, prospects that the Bears may draft, kind of focusing around that pick number 10, but also expanding it to some of the later picks that may come out of some of these schools. So today I'm joined by Dan Hope. He's the editor and lead Ohio State football beat writer for 11 Warriors. So, Dan, I really appreciate you hopping on with me.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me.
Of course. I was kind of joking with you before we started. I was like, there's so many Ohio State prospects in this draft where no way we're going to be able to get to all of them. Even just on PFF's top 100, there's 14 Ohio State players. So we'll get to some of the ones that I think are being mocked to Bears at 10, or maybe if the Bears trade back a little bit, that type of situation. And then we'll get to some of our favorite players in this draft of Buckeyes. So I want to start. That gives me, I'm going to go ahead and say I'm going to skip for now the Mika Egbuka and Josh Simmons, just because of what I have seen linked to the Bears the most, and that's TreVeyon Henderson. It's an interesting thing. I think that the Bears fans, Bears media keeps going back and forth about that running back position and how important it is. Some people say, heck yeah, do it. You need another running back. Some people are saying, no, you have DeAndre Swift and Ben Johnson's here to revitalize everything, so you're okay. But I do want to talk about TreVeyon Henderson, because I think that when you talk about the run game and the offense in general at Ohio State this year, it was a big part of what made them successful in a lot of ways. And Dan, I'm a Notre Dame fan, so I'm still grieving. But let's chat him a little bit. Let's start with just that the role that TreVeyon played on that offense, especially having two backs like him and Judkins.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing with TreVeyon is he's that home run hitter, right? He's that guy who, I mean, you saw it in the Cotton Bowl against Texas, one of the last plays before halftime. He takes a screen out of the backfield, 75-yard touchdown, totally changes the game. And I think that's the number one thing TreVeyon is going to bring to an offense. And I mean, you mentioned that Ben Johnson offense. You think of Jahmyr Gibbs and what he was to that offense in Detroit. I think TreVeyon's a guy who could bring some of those similar qualities in terms of being, that real home run hitter that you compare with a DeAndre Swift and be a real weapon out of a backfield. And so I think, if he was there at that early second round, he'd probably make a lot of sense for the Bears as somebody who could, really kind of take that offense over the top. And I think, one of the biggest things we saw from TreVeyon in his senior years, he always had that big playability, but I think he really became a more complete back in that last year. I think particularly his pass blocking really improved. And I think that gives him that ability to play on any down in the NFL. And so I think, TreVeyon's a guy, I mean, I've heard, some people are speculating he might even go in the first round. That's how well he played this past year. But I think, between that late first, early second, I think there's going to be a lot of interest in TreVeyon because of how dynamic he is.
What do you think it was? Just that normal development through college, the experience, the reps, is that what makes you think that last year was kind of, you saw this whole next level of what TreVeyon could be?
I think that's certainly part of it. They also had a running back coach change last year where, in March, Tony Alford unexpectedly left for their rival for Michigan. Carlos Locklyn came in from Oregon. I think that he was able to learn some new techniques from Carlos Locklyn that helped him become a more complete back. And then, if you talk to anybody at Ohio State about TreVeyon, he was one of the hardest workers in the building. He's a guy who, they just always felt like they could count on him every day to show up, do his job, be a leader, really high character guy. And so I think, TreVeyon's a guy who, not just, very physically gifted, but I think will also bring a lot of positive qualities off the field that teams will like.
Yeah, which is something that I know Ryan Poles is a big character guy. I say that a lot on my podcast because it's true. He passed up on a Jalen Carter because he wasn't sure of the character aspect of it. And so I do think that's something they factor in. And when we go back to, I talk about that Notre Dame game because it's what it's the relativity, but also I'm very familiar with it. But throughout the season, one thing that really stood out with me with TreVeyon was he has that explosiveness, which you kind of just mentioned, but he also has that ability to kind of like slow up when he needs to, find a lane, take off, and it feels like there's no way to stop that. Do you think that's something that will just continue to grow and kind of be able to translate over to the next level?
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely got that cutting ability that makes him special, that ability, like you said, to stop and start. He's a guy who's hard to tackle in space. So yeah, I think it will. I mean, I think really if I had a question mark about TreVeyon, it would just be that durability of playing a full, NFL season, because, this past year was really the only year that he didn't miss time due to injuries. And a big part of that was because they brought in Quinshon Judkins and they had that really good 1-2 punch. I think you want to pair him with another running back. I think TreVeyon will be best suited by an offense where he's getting, 12 to 15 touches a game, not 25. So I think pairing him with someone like a DeAndre Swift would be a good situation for him. I think my biggest concern would be, if you're asking him to run the ball 300 times a year, will he be able to hold up physically? But I think having him in a timeshare like he had at Ohio State this past season worked really well for him.
And so maybe that's why the links to Chicago are happening, because they do have a DeAndre Swift who can be that main guy on your offense. And then you have a Roschon that can be that goal line guy if you need it. And then you can have TreVeyon be the other guy in all of the other moments that you need. When you talk about, one of the things I think we don't talk about enough with running backs, and I think maybe we've started a little bit more now that we've been so focused on quarterbacks and how much they're getting sacked and whose fault is it and all of these things. One of the things that a lot of people, when you look at the draft boards and when you look at some of the profiles and stuff like that, they talk about how good he is in the pass pro. And I don't know if that's something that just a normal fan who just kind of casually watched Ohio State games realized, but is that something you guys talk about a lot?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you looked on social media over the course of a season, there were several clips of him that got a lot of attention because he was, pancaking blockers in pass pro. And I think that's an area you talk about his improvement from his past years to his senior year. I think that's without a doubt the biggest area where his game grew, where I think, that was not a strength of his game in previous years. And I think he made it one through hard work in his senior year.
Which we love that. I love seeing those. The development of guys anyways, I think is important. And I think that sometimes through college football, having those guys, you can tell the guys that really want it, because those things that maybe they were not good at, a coach, you talk about a new running back coach come in and he probably said, hey, this is something that if you want to get drafted high, this is maybe something that we need to work on a little bit. And it worked. It's something that everybody's talking about now. But when we talk about that 1-2 punch that you guys had with him and Judkins, and I'm guessing part of it was the injury issue. So Ohio State felt like they needed to bring in a Judkins just in case, but they were able to really make that balance work. So for maybe people who aren't as familiar, tell us a little bit about how that duo worked in Ohio State this year between those two backs.
Yeah, I think they really found a great balance between those guys where, they were fortunate that both of them stayed healthy all year long. And so they were really able to really balance out the carries between those two throughout the season. And, there were times where, people were like, shouldn't TreVeyon be getting more touches? Like, there's games where it's like he'd only have 8 touches, but he'd have 100 yards from scrimmage because of that explosive ability that he had. And so I think it was very much by design. And I think one of the reasons why it worked is I think both guys were very much on board with it. I think, for Quinshon Judkins, a lot of people were like, why would you transfer to Ohio State? You're going to have to split carries with TreVeyon Henderson. And if you ask Quinshon about that, he did that on purpose because he took so many carries his first 2 years at Ole Miss that, he was worried about how that would affect him in terms of going to the NFL, in terms of having too much tread on his tires. So he intentionally went to a situation where he was going to get less carries because he wanted to keep his body fresh. He wanted to perform at his best when he was on the field. And I think TreVeyon, Ryan Day talked about it multiple times about how when they brought Quinshon in, the first person he called before they signed Quinshon was TreVeyon. And he said, hey, are you okay with this? And TreVeyon said to Ryan Day, if it'll help the team, let's do it. And so I think that speaks to who TreVeyon is as a person, that he's one of those guys. He always put the team first. And I think both those guys did a great job of kind of putting their egos aside and recognizing that playing together was going to make both of them better and make the team better. And obviously you look at the end results of the season, it worked out the way it was supposed to.
Yeah, they definitely got to cash in on that. The little bit of taking away, not being, I guess the selflessness turned into them getting a national championship. So it worked out. And yeah, when you talk about that offense, when you go back to that Notre Dame game, even though I think TreVeyon ended up having like under 50 yards in that game, but Quinshon went off, and that's the unpredictability of having the two backs. One of them is going to go off, and you never know really which one. Unfortunate for Notre Dame. But one of the things that really stands out with me with Judkins is you talk about that. He came this last year, and all of a sudden you're learning a whole new offense. You're learning a new playbook, and you're able to succeed at such a high level that quickly, I think that is a testament to how quickly even maybe we could possibly see him transfer to the NFL too, and learning that offense in the new playbooks.
Yeah, I think Quinshon's a guy, but he's just got a very well-rounded skill set. Like with TreVeyon, you talk about kind of that home run ability. That's kind of his trademark. I feel like with Quinshon, like I don't know if there's that one thing I can put my finger on and like this is what makes him special. I think it's just his all-around skill set. I mean, he tested great at the combine. You saw that. I think honestly proved to be a better athlete than I even realized he was. But this, he's got that power. He finishes forward through contact. He's obviously got the athleticism. Again, I think he's, maybe I wouldn't say that catching the ball out of a backfield is his strength, but it's something he's shown that he can do. I mean, he caught a touchdown pass in the national championship game. He's a capable blocker. So I think he's just got that well-rounded skill set where, he's a guy you feel like you can plug in to a rotation. Again, ideally, probably in kind of a 2 or 3 back rotation. But I think he's one of those guys who's going to be able to go into the NFL and play very quickly.
Would you say he's more of the after contact force missed tackle guy than TreVeyon Henderson?
I would. I think that, I think Quinshon, he's bigger, and I think he's got more of that, downhill running seat contact. I mean, there was another play, I think, of a national championship game where he stiff armed a guy, and that was really a big highlight. I think he's more inclined to seek contact, whereas I think TreVeyon is more inclined to try to make people miss in space.
Yeah, and that's what I think when it comes to what a team wants to do and what the scouts and the GM is evaluating which type of back they need. And if I feel like if you already, that's what it'll be really, I'm very, very interested which route the Bears go with the running back, because obviously I don't see an Ashton Genty getting to 10. So this running back class is so deep though, and there's so many different types of backs and that you can get, that it's just going to be very interesting to see which one they land on. But I'd be shocked if they didn't leave this draft with at least one of them. I want to switch to some of these other players. I want to get to the defensive side a little bit, and the positional needs more so of what the Bears need at this point, which is defensive line. That's one of the biggest question marks, I think, even though they added a Grady Jarrett and a Dio Ajingbo in this offseason. But I still think a name that some people may be floating around a little bit is a Tyleik Williams. He's a defensive tackle, obviously 3-tech guy. That interior, one of the things that I read about him is talking about how much he reshaped his body. He got to Columbus at 360 and then now is around playing at like 327 this last season. So I think you can notice that, what he was able to do on the line. But chat a little bit about him and like where you think his best place is on that line too.
Yeah, it's really impressive the way, Tyleik his last couple of years, the amount of snaps he played. I mean, typically Larry Johnson, Ohio State's defensive line coach, has been known for rotating defensive linemen a lot. Tyleik rarely came off the field, and he was able to play at a consistently high level despite being really big for a guy who, people see him and they think he's a nose tackle, but he's actually not. He's actually a free technique. You watch him play. His skill is really his quickness off the line, his ability to penetrate the backfield and blow up plays. And I think that's really where he can be a difference maker at the next level. I think especially in the run game, I think he's a guy who can create a lot of disruption inside. Probably not a guy who's going to put up, Aaron Donald kind of sack numbers, but somebody who can, get that interior pressure, who I think can disrupt a lot of things in the run game, and a guy who I think, has a really, really good skill set. I think, the physical traits are there. And I think you saw him over the course of his career develop in terms of that technique, in terms of that handwork to be able to create more disruption at the line of scrimmage.
Yeah, I think that if he's able, I think this is a guy that if he is able to develop or continue to develop that pass rush side, he could be a really, really good player that people are talking about. And the Dennis Allen, the Bears, that new defensive coordinator for the Bears, he is very, like, a lot of his defenses run heavily on that interior pass rush. So he's been good at developing that too, though. So somebody like this who has the tools when it comes to the run against the run game and stopping the run and things like that, and all the physical tools, maybe it's appealing to a Dennis Allen to be like, hey, I can just develop this one part of him and he can be the perfect fit for the line. And so that is one interesting one to me. There is a couple more. This one, you got to help me with the name. The Edge, JT.
Tuimoloau.
Tuimoloau?
Tuimoloau.
Okay. I'll get it eventually if we draft him, definitely. But I keep seeing him on a lot of different boards when it comes to those edge rushers. The edge class this year is interesting. I feel like there's a couple at the top that a lot of people like, and then there's a lot that kind of bunch up together. But tell us a little bit about him and his role, because I think when we talk about this last year in Ohio State, we talk about the running backs and kind of what they were able to do offensively, but the defense a lot too is a lot of the chatter and what they were able to do, especially in their run in the playoffs.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, you look at JT's numbers in the CFP. I believe he had 10 and a half tackles for loss in the CFP alone. He was dominant. I think if he had played like that level his whole career, we'd be talking about a top 15 pick. I mean, you're talking about a guy who was a top 5 overall recruit coming out of high school. All the physical tools are there. He ran a little bit hot and cold, I think, during his college career. I mean, you think back a couple years ago of a game he had at Penn State. It was one of the best games that an Ohio State player has ever had. I mean, he had 2 interceptions, like 4 tackles. It was crazy. The numbers were absolutely crazy what he did in that game. It took him a while to get to a point of where he was really producing at that level consistently. You know, he'd have a big game and he'd kind of go quiet for a few games. But at the end of the career there, that CFP run, it really all came together where he put together 4 back-to-back great games. Even though he got hurt in the Texas game, hurt his ankle, he was still really productive in that national championship game against Notre Dame. And so I think all the tools are there for JT to be an excellent player. Again, I mean, you know, is he a guy that you'd project to have, 15 sacks in a season? Probably not. But I think, all the physical tools are there for him to be a really effective pass rusher in the NFL. I think, run defense, I would say, if I was comparing the 2 defensive ends, I think Jack Sawyer was a little bit more consistent in terms of that, setting the edge, holding his gap in the run game. But I think JT's a guy that you saw, he can really blow up plays. And so I think he's a guy, if you were to pair him with a Montez Sweat, I think that could be a great situation for him where, maybe he's not that number 1 pass rusher in an NFL defense, but I think he can be a great complementary secondary defensive end starter.
Let's go. You just mentioned Jack Sawyer. That's another one. Are you surprised at all in a lot of these rankings that Jack Sawyer is as low as he is in a lot of people's draft boards?
I am, but I mean, I'm very high on Jack Sawyer. Another guy, you talk about all those intangible qualities. Like that's a guy like incredibly high motor, like fantastic leader. I think a guy that, was really a big reason why that whole national championship season came together was he was kind of a ringleader of bringing everybody back for their senior years, going to make that run. And I mean, you look at what he did in the CFP. I mean, made one of the greatest plays in Ohio State history with his sack on Quinn Ewers that he returned for a touchdown. The guy's a gamer. I think, the reason why he's dropping is, the arm length and some of the physical stuff that, and maybe he doesn't quite fit like the prototype for an NFL defensive end, but he's just one of those guys. Like he's a football player. Like he's one of those guys you put on the pads, you go play. He's going to go out there and make plays. He's got, great instincts, a guy who just absolutely loves the game of football. And I also think, in terms of using his hands, I think that's really where he stands out. And that, he's probably not like the fastest guy, but I think his ability to use his hands to shed blocks, he's got really good strength and power. I think he's a really creative pass rusher and his ability to shed blocks. And I think, again, much like JT, he really peaked in that end of his senior season, played his best football in the CFP. And like, to me, like that matters. Like if you can go and play against teams like Texas and Oregon and Notre Dame and Tennessee and play your best football against those teams and play your best football and those bright lights, I think that shows that you're ready to go play in the NFL spotlight. And so for me, I think Jack's a guy that, if he ends up being a 3rd round pick or whatever people are projecting, I think there's a very good chance he's going to be a steal.
Do you see both of those guys as like true edge guys in the NFL?
I think so. Yeah. I think, they're probably both best suited to be 4-3 defensive ends. Jack, a couple years ago at Ohio State, they kind of tried to move him into like an outside linebacker role, and that didn't quite work out. So I think he's best suited as a hand in the dirt defensive end and a 4-man front. And I would say the same for JT. I think, the physical tools would be there for JT to make that move and play kind of an outside linebacker role if needed. But personally, I think both those guys are best suited to play as a true 4-man front defensive end.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying mostly. I just know that sometimes it's funny how much we have the conversation about the tackles, the offensive tackles, and how they need to move inside. But when it comes to the defensive positions, I feel like we're always like, he's an edge if he's an edge. If he's an off-ball linebacker, he's an off-ball linebacker. And you don't talk about as much moving them. I guess sometimes you have the situations where it's like they're versatile, so you can play them anywhere. But another guy I wanted to mention, let's go back up to the top of some of these Ohio State rankings, and it's the tackle Josh Simmons, obviously coming off an ACL. So let's start there. When did he tear his ACL again?
It was actually a torn patellar tendon, and that occurred in October, the 6th game of the season against Oregon.
Okay, so a little bit more on that. How far along? Do you know anything about the extent of that? Is he any timeline at all?
Yeah, so he said he's ahead of schedule. He was actually able to do a very brief workout at Ohio State's Pro Day last month. So he didn't go through like a full set of drills, running 40 or anything, but he was able to go up there for just a couple minutes and, show some movement ability. And so I think that was a big positive for him. Everything I've heard, everything he's said is that, he's on a very good trajectory in terms of his recovery there. And so I think, the expectation is he would be available to play as a rookie.
So let's start with that then, because I think the conversation with the Bears is that the offensive line seems like they've put enough into it at this point where it doesn't have to be highly addressed. Other people still say that maybe Braxton Jones, they don't completely love Braxton Jones. So do you need a left tackle, or do you try to move Darnell Wright over to left tackle and find a right tackle? Whatever the case may be, a lot of these guys at the top, obviously Will Howard, Armand Mimbo are the two ranked usually right ahead of Josh Simmons, and him just behind that. So share a little bit, because the Ohio State offensive line was a big part of the way they were able to run the ball this last year, and the way that Will Howard kind of had time to do a lot of the things that he was able to do late. But share a little bit about the line in general, how it worked, and what role that Simmons really played on that line too.
Yeah, I mean, I think Josh Simmons, you really saw before that injury, the growth in him. Like you talk about guys who grew him from like junior to senior year. I think you really saw a lot of growth where he was a guy in his first year at Ohio State, and then going back to when he was at San Diego State, penalties were a big issue for him. And I think he really cleaned up his technique, really got a lot better. And, he was a guy that people were talking about as an All-American player before he went down with that injury. So he was playing at a really high level. And you saw it. I think you saw the value of him the most when he went down, because it took them a while to figure out how to replace him. Now, ultimately, they settled on Donovan Jackson moving out to left tackle, and that, of course, being another guy in this NFL draft class. And Donovan Jackson might end up being a first-round pick because of how well he played at left tackle after making that move. He did a fantastic job of moving from his natural position of guard and filling in at left tackle. But it took Ohio State a few games to get to that ultimate alignment. And so, it was really a credit to, what Ohio State was able to do, realigning that line to have the success they did after losing 2 NFL draft prospects in Josh Simmons and Seth McLaughlin to season-ending injuries. But I think, before that injury, I think Josh Simmons was really the guy who was kind of leading the way up front. And I think he's a guy who has, you kind of think about the prototype of what you want in a left tackle. He might be the guy who fits that better than any other prospect in this draft in terms of his athleticism, his measurables. I think he's got everything you look for in an NFL left tackle. He doesn't have that much experience to go back on. It's unfortunate he didn't have the opportunity to play that full season, because I think if he had played the way he had played in those first 6 games for a full year, he'd be in contention to be the top tackle in this draft. He didn't get the opportunity to play as many of those high-level opponents and really put that improvement on film against high-level opponents. So, that's something that could hurt him in terms of, you're talking about a very high pick in the draft. But I think he's still a guy who's going to be a first-round pick, because the physical upside of his ability to play at one of the premier positions in the NFL, I think, is very high.
Yeah, I was talking to John Jansen when I was doing former Michigan offensive lineman, and he did the Michigan episode with me, and we were talking about that tackle position. And one of the things he said that stuck out to me was, if you are saying that if you are guaranteeing somebody or saying there's a very high chance that they're going to be drafting their left tackle for the next decade, you take it, because it's really hard to do. It's really hard to find that guy that can, number one, stay on the field, and number two, play at that high level. You're one of the most important positions on the field because you're protecting that blind side of the quarterback most times. And so I do think that that is a factor in, and it's hard sometimes when you're like, oh, well, we already have someone that's okay at that position, but is okay enough if you're talking about protecting Caleb Williams for the next 10 years, that's where that conversation comes in. And when you talk about Donovan Jackson and we talk about the experience, because of that switch before that, was he left guard before that? He just slid over? Okay. So the experience mainly at left guard and then coming over and doing what he did at left tackle. Do you think a team will draft him as a guard or a tackle?
It sounds like guard is probably where he'll get drafted to play. That's what he said when we've had opportunities to talk to him during the draft process. And so I do think guard is his best and most natural position, but I think what he showed was he can play tackle if you need him to. And that, of course, is so valuable in the NFL where, you're only going to roster 8, 9 offensive linemen or whatnot. To have that guy who, he's probably going to be a starting left guard, but he could slide out to tackle in a situation where one of your tackles go down. That really helps his value. And I think the way he played in that CFP run really showed he is capable of playing that tackle position because, he was going up against some really good edge rushers in the CFP and he didn't allow a sack. So I think guard is still his best, most natural position, but I think, I think that versatility he's going to offer is real because I think if you needed him to play tackle, he'd be capable of it.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing. And it's someone that the Bears just parted ways with Tevin Jenkins, who has kind of been a big part. Unfortunately, injuries have just ravaged the beginning of his career, which is really unfortunate because he's one of those guys that I truly feel like can play every position on the line, maybe outside of center. I've never seen him snap the ball, so I don't know about that, but both guard positions, both tackle positions. So if you have somebody that does have that versatility, to your point, if your left tackle goes down and you have the confidence that your left guard can slide out and fill that position at a high level, that does add value to me for those offensive line positions. I want to ask you about one more, and then I'll get your thoughts on maybe some of the ones that you like. But wide receiver, Emeka Egbuka, obviously is a big one that a lot of people are talking about. Looks like a lot of the projections have him like late first round, early second round. The Bears do have 2 second-round picks, so we'll see about that. I don't know how high wide receiver is on their board because of DJ Moore and Rome Odunze on their roster. But that I don't think that completely says they're not taking one if someone like this ends up falling to them. But what type of receiver would you title Egbuka as?
Yeah, I think he's likely a slot receiver in the NFL. That's what he was primarily at Ohio State. So I think that's probably where he fits best. He has played some outside. I mean, he's got the size and athleticism where I think he's capable of playing outside, but I think the slot is really where he's going to fit best at the next level. Another guy, I mean, you're talking about Ohio State's all-time receptions leader, was one of those very consistent, productive guys. Another guy, team captain, really high character guy, does all the little things well. He's a good perimeter blocker. He's good with the ball in his hands. I think, he's one of those guys like he's probably not going to be like a number 1 receiver in the NFL. He's probably not going to be a superstar, but I think he can be a really good, like second, third receiver in the NFL for a long time. One of those guys who, you can really rely on to do his job consistently and who does have that ability after the catch where he can turn some shorter passes into big plays.
Yeah, we were just I was talking to one of the guys I work with here at the radio station, and we were talking about the wide receivers that Ohio State has pumped out recently. And it's like they just keep churning them out. It's like one after another. But he had 10 touchdowns too, actually 2 seasons with Ohio State where he had 10 touchdowns. Was that can you see that world too where in the NFL where he kind of is a red zone target guy?
Yeah, I think he certainly has that capability. I mean, he's not a guy who's necessarily going to be that you throw it up and he's going to go over somebody and get it. I think he's more of that, he's a really good route runner. So I think it's more, you're going to be looking to have him
Keenan
run
Allen-ish.
But yeah, I think Keenan's actually a good comparison for Emeka. I really think it is. I think, his ability to get open with his route running, get the ball in his hands and find space. He's not that guy who you're going to throw a 40-yard go ball to and have him go win a 50-50 ball over a corner. He's more of that guy that you're going to want to get him open in space, get the ball in his hands, and then he's got that ability, if he finds a crease, to be able to turn, that shorter pass into a bigger gain.
Yeah, and obviously Keenan was a big part of Caleb's development last year, and that route running is a huge thing when it comes to that. You have a Rowan Madunze who is that 50-50 contested catch guy, and then DJ Moore who can do a little bit of everything. So a guy like that I think does fit if the Bears were going to address something this high, that kind of fit. But Dan, before I let you go, are there any other names that I didn't mention that you really like in this draft that you could see? I know you don't know all the Bears needs, do's, and don'ts, but somebody that you just really like that you see making immediate impact on some team.
Yeah, it's really a fun draft class to cover for Ohio State because, they've got 15 guys who I think are probably all going to be drafted. And I truly believe all 15 of them have a chance to be, effective players in the NFL. I wouldn't be shocked to see any of these 15 guys go on to become quality starters in the NFL. And I think, some of them certainly have star potential. I think a guy I believe I saw today that he actually visited the Chicago Bears. And so I will bring him up as Jordan Hancock. I think he's a guy who's a little bit under the radar right now, that a lot of the mocks I'm seeing have him as a late round draft pick. I wouldn't be surprised if he goes more like middle rounds. I mean, you look at what he did at Ohio State's pro day. He had a 41.5-inch vertical jump, which would have been the second best at the combine. He ran, I believe, 4.42 40. He tested like one of the best defensive backs in the draft. And I think he's maybe a little bit overlooked because of the fact that he primarily played slot corner at Ohio State. But you look at what he did for Ohio State in the second half of the season. He was basically playing slot corner half the time and safety half the time. Yep. And they were really moving him around because of Caleb Downs and what he could do. They wanted to move Caleb around more and play him more closer to the line of scrimmage. So Jordan, from one play to the next, could be up on the line of scrimmage playing slot corner one play, dropping back and playing free safety the next play. And he did a great job no matter where they asked him to play. He did a great job of executing his assignments. And so you talk about versatility. I think Jordan Hancock's a guy who could be a really good, early day free pick for somebody that could come in and, his primary position is probably playing that nickel corner slot, but he could also play safety. He's played outside. I think he's one of those guys that you bring in and he can have a lot of value, whether it's as, a starter or as a top backup, because you can move him all around the secondary and he could kind of be your utility guy back there, as well as offering value on special teams. So he's a guy that to me is not getting enough love right now as a draft prospect, but I think could go on to have a really good NFL career.
I actually love that you bring that up because the safety position is interesting in Chicago because they have Jaquan Brisker and Kevin Byard, who are really good safeties. But the problem is Jaquan Brisker has back-to-back years now with concussions, and this last year he missed half the season with a concussion. So I do think the Bears address the safety position at some point. I'm not sure where. The interesting thing is I just clicked real quick because I'll go to certain places to just trying to see comps, and comps are weird. Sometimes I'm like, there's no way that doesn't match. But the first name on Jordan Hancock's comp on this specific one is Hufanga, which I would take in a heartbeat if we're comparing somebody to him. And obviously USC player who obviously Caleb Williams loves too. But I love that you brought that up because I think that safety position will be addressed. And I did not see the 30 visit from him. So if that is, then that's something that obviously they're keeping an eye on. And Ryan Poles really keeps to his top 30 visits. He's drafted a lot of his top 30 visits since he's been here as the GM. But yeah, so I love that. And I think that when you talk about the nickel corner, the safety kind of being able to do both, they just gave a big contract to Kyler Gordon. So you have your nickel corner, but having a guy, to your point, who's versatile and can do a little bit of everything gives you that depth piece that I think could be really important in the secondary, especially a Dennis Allen secondary that he's probably going to obsess over.
Yeah, and Lathan Ransom could be another guy to watch as well there at that safety position. Another guy who I think probably projects him in middle rounds, but if they're looking for, someone to come in and kind of be that top backup safety, I think he could be another guy to watch as well. A guy who's, strong safety is going to be his best position. A guy who can, when he can come downhill and really, react and hit, that's really where you saw Lathan do a lot of his best work at Ohio State, but a guy who also, I think by the end of his career, became a really good coverage safety as well. So, he's another player that I'll be interested to watch, and kind of that late day 2, early day 3 range. Does someone, draft him? And I think he has a chance to carve out a very good career for himself as well.
Well, Dan, I see a very busy draft weekend for you.
That's for sure.
With all of these guys getting drafted, but I really appreciate your time. And if we do get any of these Ohio State guys, I would love to have you back on to chat a little bit more in depth about some of them. But I hope you have a good rest of your week. And again, thank you so much.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me.
Thanks.